I'd like to call to order the November 16th, 2023 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee. Agenda, unless there are any concerns, will be considered approved, and I don't see anybody looking worried, so we'll move on from that. To the approval of the September 21, 2023 Land Use Advisory Committee minutes.
Motion to approve.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous. Okay, we have minutes. So first information item is minimum density requirements, Mrs. Esmaeili.
Thank you, Chair Wolf, committee members. Hi, I'm Raya Esmaeili. I'm a planning analyst with Local Planning Assistance. Probably know me very well by this point, so I'll skip any further introduction. I'm back here with you to talk a little more about the density requirements and generally conversation on this as part of the land use policy, so the land use densities. This is basically a continuation of our, of our density discussion from the LUAC meeting in July. Okay. So just to give a big picture background, minimum density requirements and other regional policies are based on community designations. And community designations are grouping of communities based on their similarities and differences. And the map before you is the Thrive MSP 2040 community designations. I have included the minimum density requirements that are part of Thrive, because that's still the plan in effect. And throughout the course of 2022, staff worked with you, with local planners, with other internal council staff to identify and refine these designations as part of the 2050 regional planning process. So that brings us to the proposed 2050 community designations. And the results of those efforts are this map. And as a reminder, the designations, we talked about it, was only updated within MUSA. So we just left anything outside of MUSA alone, and we updated the variables so that the three variables that were used to create these groupings are age of housing, which was a proxy for age of infrastructure, intersection density, I'm forgetting it myself, and the planned residential densities, which were based on the local 2040 comprehensive plans. These proposed designations were recommended by you to the Community Development Committee, which were then presented to CDC and the Committee of the Whole earlier this year, and will be adopted together with the rest of the 2050 Regional Development Guide, or Imagine 2050, and the policy plans. So these community designations are a basis for policy development and trying to modify our requirements based on different community characteristics. So this is to just make sure that we are capturing characteristics of these communities that may not align with each other, basically. The minimum density is one of those requirements that has been developed based on community designation. In July, here at LUAC, staff presented to you some information on existing density of communities, as well as planned densities based on 2030 and 2040 comprehensive plans. We had some discussion. We have since updated that information to make sure and account for all of the undevelopable land as much as we possibly could based on data available. And also have added some additional density measures to better understand the development trends in communities around the region. So in the next few slides, we'll be going through this information, and the information is separated by Thrive community designations to basically better align our understanding with the existing requirements, because we haven't developed anything for these ones yet. So we're just going to analyze the trends based on Thrive. So this is the first of a few slides. In this slide and the next few slides, they all follow a very similar structure. So I will explain on this slide what we're looking at. I will explain each of these measures, but as we are going through this, this information, I'm happy to go over that explanation again. And before I start explaining this, I realize I never said that why we're here. We do have some discussion questions for you at the end of this presentation, which is based on this information that we're presenting to you to give some kind of direction in terms of policy development, not the actual minimum density number, but rather other land use policies that are related and around density itself that help implement the minimum density requirement. So going back to the slide, starting from the left, and that's the dark blue, it kind of shows the overall net developed acres regardless of when housing units were developed. So this is just the basically the existing as is right now on the ground. The range that you're seeing on this slide is basically representing densities of different communities. So the lowest in this case is 4.9 units per acre, and the highest is 13.6. Each of those numbers are the density for a unique specific community. It just shows that within the urban center designation, the existing density of all times, the developed density, is for one community is as low as 4.9, and for one is as high as 13.6. So it's just that one number. Then the green bar right next to it shows the developed density for those units developed between 2010 and 2020. This number was developed based on the 2010 and 2020 generalized land use information that the council conducts through a very rigorous process. And then the density is calculated on any of the land uses that were changed between 2010 and 2020 from undeveloped or in the case of other designations, could be agricultural, farmstead, or something like that in 2010, and then in 2020, they were residential. And then we use the residential permit numbers for the same time frame to account for calculation of density in these areas. So that's how this number was created. So basically, it represents the most recent development activity in urban center communities.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes, please.
So the lowest approved development was 2.4 and the highest was 44.5.
Kind of. So as I mentioned, it's not the 2.4 or 40, either of those numbers aren't it could be one development or it could be multiple developments because it is just the total number of units that were developed during this time frame on total number of acres that those units were developed. So it could represent multiple projects or one project. We can certainly try to dig in for a given community, but that's just, we're talking about like 70,000 new housing units across the region, within USA. So that would get into a lot of weeds, but
so those numbers represent cities, not developments.
Well, they're cities.
They're cities,
That's the density for
So it's
the
across
city.
a city, any development.
Yes.
That
in that
includes,
time.
who was 2.4?
It's the built environment
I knew that.
from all time.
No,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
talking about the second.
These are only in the urban center.
Right now, I don't know if that's right.
Well, where is the urban center?
St. Paul, Minneapolis.
The urban center,
Yeah, problem.
It includes the
There you
It's more
urban and the urban edge.
if you're comparing it to the 2050 designation, yes. But we're talking about in these charts, we're only looking at them in the form of dry community designations because of the density requirement purposes. But it's this very dark orange. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington, Richfield, and so on.
So you could have had Robbinsdale adding a couple of single-family homes on a
Yeah.
lot that was something else, and that would give 2.4.
Well, that's the thing that this number doesn't capture as well necessarily in some of these very higher, like super urban areas is potentially some redevelopments because if they went from residential to residential.
Oh.
So it is, and there I acknowledge that there are some density, some instances in some of these communities that went from, let's say, a single-family home to a fourplex or something like that. It is not captured in that information.
There's a gap in the data.
A little bit, mostly in the very urbanized area, because as you're moving further out, you see less of those types of developments. We have more of industrial to residential or something else to residential.
Commercial to residential.
Yeah.
Or vacant to residential.
What's that?
Or vacant to residential.
Vacant to residential, that's
Or elementary
actually,
school to residential.
yeah, so in some of these, in these cases, unless, if it was, and a lot of these urban center communities do have a lot of infill development, all of those are captured because they are going from vacant to residential. It's if it was residential to maybe a higher density or the same number of units wouldn't be captured in this. And I am sorry, I am just pulling up.
So do you capture it if I tear down 2 houses and build one?
So
Same
either direction
scenario.
is not captured if they went that way. I hope we don't have too many of those.
Well, I'm just talking about Minneapolis and Edina.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
other town.
Yes. Okay, I was, so the net developed, the 2.4 was Richfield, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, where was I? There we go. Then the lighter blue that is in front of you is basically the densities that were, these same communities, urban center communities, identified for future development in their 2030 plans versus the red bar, which is what they identified in their 2040 plans. The one thing that I will note here is that this number is the minimum, which is like the, basically they said at a minimum it's going to be this this many units per acre. So and also I want to note that between 2030 and 2040 plans, some of our requirements have shifted. So you see that in the general the movement of that bar from the light blue to the red. Yes.
Just for my clarification,
Yeah.
red 98.1, are you saying that cities or whatever in their comp plans said they're gonna put 98 units to an acre?
Yes.
How-
That's the
well,
city of
gonna be, what,
Minneapolis.
20 stories high? I mean,
Or more, yeah, that's
Yeah.
Minneapolis.
That's Minneapolis.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
I got you, because an acre, I think is all that big,
Yeah.
put an apartment building on or something.
The city of Minneapolis is certainly a little bit of an outlier, as in terms of in the urban center communities that is very high. But after the city of Minneapolis, the one after that is about 49 units per acre.
Okay.
So it's still very high.
So Minneapolis traditionally has built very tall apartment buildings, is that what you're saying?
Yes. Tall and also denser, not necessarily taller, but smaller lot sizes or more number of units on the lot as well. And that's the 2040, I should say, plan. As you can see in the existing density in the dark blue on the left side, the highest is 13.6. That's the highest that exists right now, and that actually is not Minneapolis.
Really?
Yes.
And is that just on, if I may, is that just on residential designated properties? So we're not like averaging it across all the commercial and park space and all that, it's
No.
just residential?
Yeah.
So, interesting.
So is that on a per project basis?
This is built. The dark blue, you mean? Or the red? Which one?
So any of these are a number for a community?
Yes. Any of them are a
In
number
whatever
for a
category it is.
community, not a range representing one community. They represent one designation, but each of these numbers represent a different community within that designation. It is possible that the same community that, for example, has 4.9 also has 2.4, for example, but not in this case.
It's on an average, so like, I'm just trying to think, because this will feed into the conversation
Yeah.
later. So if Corcoran has 7 developments,
Mm-hmm.
one is 3 per acre, one is 40 per acre, one is another's 3 per acre, one's 5 per acre. And those are being developed today hypothetically. Would then we have an average score of 20 on this chart?
It depends on how many units are in each of those
Yeah.
developments.
So, kind of. The number will probably be close to average, except that in trying to calculate this, we didn't grab each different project and then average the number out, but rather we grabbed like those 4 or 5 projects that you explained. They resulted in, say, 83 or whatever units on so many acres, and then calculated one
During-
density out of it.
2010 to 20.
Yes.
So, okay.
2010 to 2020 for the green line, and then the dark blue has no time limit.
So
It's
that's today.
today, as
Everything
communities
that's
stand, built in all the time.
The current built environment.
Yes.
Well, that's the current where it says planned. The light blue is,
The light blue is what communities identified in their 2030 plan for future. So in their 2030 plan, they said that basically by 2030, the new developments that we're gonna be building are gonna be at this density. And then the red one is the same concept, but from the 2040
And
plans.
that the stuff in the green bar was built under the rules in the light blue bar, correct?
Yes, mostly,
Yes.
unless there were some communities,
That,
Who got their
they were
2030
really late
approved
on
late,
getting
yeah.
them approved, yeah.
so one of the things that we're gonna talk about is density requirements for today, for a new project. That's
Uh,
later in this discussion,
so
later in the discussion.
Yes.
we will talk about more of the requirements and policies around the density, implementation of that density, not the actual number though today. However, if you have specific thoughts or comments about that, we definitely wanna capture it.
That's, yeah, that,
We will be bringing that conversation in future.
yeah, cause that's, I'm wondering, I'm looking at the data, honing in on how you develop the data, and then there's no disagreement, whatever the number is, we already had that discussion. But what I'm thinking about is if there's an expectation of 3 and we have those projects I mentioned, we put 100 units on 3 acres, and then we put 9 units on 3 acres, and then 100 units on 100 acres or whatever. When we're being judged on because we deal with this all the time, when we're being judged on our density and we have to meet this 3 per requirement, is it 3 per during a specific time? Or is it like every project has to be 3 per?
The requirements as they are right now is not every project meeting 3 per. The requirements are that the overall future development, so right now the requirements also do not account for what you have built in terms of and a lot of them may be lower density.
Yeah.
It doesn't penalize communities for that. So the requirement is that any new development or redevelopment together, all of them community-wide, will be at a minimum of 3 units per acre. So in calculating that, you may have multiple residential land uses, right? You have low, medium, high,
Yeah.
mixed use and whatnot. So however many acreage you have identified in your community that will either develop, newly develop,
Yeah.
or redevelop between the time that the comprehensive plan was adopted and say in case of the red bar, 2040. So many communities had their comprehensive plans adopted or basically sent it to us in 2018, right? So the time frame is basically 2018 to 2040. During this time, any new development and redevelopment on however many acres you've identified for new development and redevelopment, in the case of your city, for example, would be at a minimum of 3 units per acre.
Do we get to bank if we have one with real high density and then have another project with low density? Like
You
if we
don't
put a
get
big
to-
apartment
yeah.
building, can we have 2-acre lots next to them?
Not quite. So we don't have a banking situation in that kind of a sense, in that whatever project you approve in the city has to be consistent with the comprehensive plan future land use. That being said, several communities are members of a program, which I will actually get to, of the plat monitoring program, which allows them to account for some of the mostly recent development as they are, because future land use density calculations that we do for comprehensive plans, each residential land use density has a range, right? Say low density residential in a community is 3 to 6. Then when we are calculating the density, we go by 3. It's like basically the worst case scenario for our system.
Before it's developed, they
Before
assume
it's
it's going to develop at the minimum density that you
Right.
said.
The plat monitoring program allows communities to record their development as they come in. So maybe it's within their low density residential, but the density of that specific development that was approved last year wasn't 3 units per acre, it was 5.5. The plat monitoring records that, and then in calculation of the future land use density calculations, in how we keep track, we do consider plat monitoring information. In fact, in approval or authorization of 2040 plans, we did have a few communities that we used plat monitoring information in order to reach basically reached a understanding that their land use plan is consistent with regional land use policies. Without it, they would have been less than
Because they
minimum
had
requirement.
more dense development recently, so they could get a break on some of the stuff that was coming.
So we've
The plat
interacted
monitoring
with,
program is essentially a credit.
we've interacted with the Met Council specifically on this topic, and we're told that that there's no benefit to us if we have clustered, high-density development that we can use to offset some of our lower-density development.
Well, it depends on how that question was asked specifically. In one, it can, like I said, it can be that that information will go into the plat monitoring program if the city, in your case, Corcoran is a plat monitoring participant. That will go into the program that we will consider it. What it cannot do is anything related that you still have to be consistent with your own comp plan. Some of the instances that we have seen is trying to do projects that are significantly different from one end of the project to the other end, and they all want to be developed in the same land use, and it just can't happen, and there's no benefit. Like, you can make it go as high as you want, this other site still cannot build at a lower density. It is beyond minimum density requirement policy that doesn't allow that to happen. It's rather land use consistency as a whole.
Okay.
Yes.
Are wetlands and storm catch basins in this number?
We tried to take out wetlands as much as we could. I have to say that the wetland database, the one that is publicly available, and it was good as it can be, I suppose. So that is taken out. Stormwater basins, in some of the, like, at least planned ones, no. But in the way that the dark blue and the green have been calculated, it actually gives quite a bit of credit to communities because they probably were taken out. So this is like kind of a best case scenario.
Just a side comment, because of, in a post-COVID world, supply shortage, nothing's changing. Developers are going to as small as they can and as high as much density everywhere. And it's not going to change with a year out on power some equipment yet. And cost of concrete and steel, we're just gonna see higher densities, whether it was planned or not. So through the discussion here, I'm finding this chart difficult to explain, not only to people here as elected, but what would you say to a developer? Because ultimately, that's on the ground, what's your message as a suburban, ring suburban, et cetera?
I would tell them to continue building at higher densities because the 2040 plans clearly allow for it. And that if you want to make up for the existing built environment, which is the dark blue, which by the way, whatever residential land use decision is made, it's gonna remain on the ground for decades and decades. The urban planning, at least here, does not shift and change residential developments that often. So basically what it means is that whatever decision you make right now, you're gonna be dealing with it 70 years from now. So yes, the dark blue was created years and decades ago, but we still are seeing that built environment impact. So I will tell the developers to make sure that the green is matching up to the red.
Well,
To make up for the
Well, the
blue.
green was supposed to match the blue and it didn't on either end.
Yeah.
Well, the world sort of switched because developers want that high density and the elected officials, they have a hard time. Because they got the public here and then they're gonna blame that council. So we got a lot of dynamics going on
Yeah, I'll never
here.
tell the builder to do whatever they want.
Well,
And you shouldn't.
Yeah.
The city.
I get that.
Yeah.
But it's, back to the 3 units per acre, really, that hasn't changed in 20 years per se.
Isn't that a functional? I always tell people the 3 per acre is functional. It's so the sewers function, right?
Well, it's so.
But it sounds like you're overlapping some other things on top of the density requirements.
Well, and that came on with, was it the last
The one before.
one? Definitely when we did 2040, there was a big upping of because before that, everybody had to have at least 3 units per acre, but they were doing much more.
Yes.
And when we adjusted that the last time, it was to kind of recognize what was actually going on the ground. And they also did a study and found that when you get at those densities, it ends up being about the same cost to serve each community. Because they looked at redevelopment and, like a theoretical redevelopment project in Minneapolis versus a greenfield development, and the cost to serve them worked out right as far as the SAC payments in terms of the infrastructure.
The one thing I was gonna point out too is that these numbers, the future numbers, are all based on our minimums that we put into
Yes.
our comp plans.
Yes.
Builders are not looking at the minimums, builders are looking at what can they put on the property, they're looking at the
Yeah,
highest.
they're looking at the
Absolutely.
maximum.
Right, so there's competing interests, if you will, I mean, these numbers look high in 3, people talk about that's high, or whatever, but in reality, builders are looking to do as much as they can, generally speaking, just because of what you're talking about in terms of costs and things like that.
Phil, did you have something you
I was
wanted to
gonna
say?
say that, to me, is the tail's wagging the dog here, because the developers are the ones that are gonna make the determination on how dense this thing's gonna be, not city councils. And
Well, and
we can have minimums and stuff, and we have to have plans for the sewer systems and things like that. I mean, that makes total sense, and how dense we wanna have these buildings. But ultimately, as Bill said, and he's correct, it's the number of units per acre, as many as they can get on that, they're gonna slam them in, because we're looking at, well, we went to 10 feet apart on one of our developments on these homes, and they're putting gravel between the houses because there's not enough room to cut the grass.
Well, and if I may add to that, So the 3 units per acre is something that has been determined for the efficiency of our wastewater system, that it cannot be less than that. Otherwise, the entire regional wastewater system will not be efficiently running, which is one of the charges of the council, making sure public dollars are used
And that's as it
efficiently
should be. That is exactly.
at
as
a
it should
minimum.
be. Exactly.
And in terms of whether or not the developers can build anything, they can't, because what can be built is what the comprehensive plan allows in the future land use designation, and all the future land uses have a minimum and maximum density. And that is something that in the 2040 round, we were very diligent about making sure, working with the cities, that they do put a number at the end and don't just say anything above 12 units per acre. And that is actually kind of like, it helps communities in those instances too, because this is the highest that you can go. I'm not saying that those numbers that are currently included in the plans are the best numbers necessarily, but that's what the local communities decided, and we're not gonna say that you can't do that. But it helps with there's a cap. They can't go, based on the comp plan itself, they cannot go further.
It just gives you direction as far as for the sewer system.
It gives
as far
you
as-
capacity
Exactly.
calculations
That's what
for
it's
the,
based on.
yeah, for the wastewater system. And there were some places where communities were going way high, like by Highway 100 and 394. We didn't have enough capacity because of all the redevelopment that was going on there. That was way more than,
Sure.
because they said what the minimum was, but they didn't say the max. And we had to slow down development so we could build more pipes, and
Right. And
those
that
were
makes
expensive
total
pipes.
sense.
And we also use that number to, like both minimum and maximum, to figure out forecasts, to make sure that what's being planned accommodates the growth.
Okay, we're way off track now.
Yeah. I
We
do wanna,
understand the chart.
yeah, I do wanna now keep moving forward, but I wanna again bring your attention to the difference between the red and green versus, well, specifically not the red and green, the dark blue and green specifically against the red. So it's kind of like how the development is happening right now. Can it even make up for the existing situation on the ground? And our way into like, how can we make it to what's being planned? So the similar number, I'm not gonna explain them again this time. We have developed the same kind of comparison for the urban community designation. This is, you may call them the first ring suburbs. And generally then you see even a bigger gap between the overall developed versus what has happened in the past decade. However, it's, it is more on par with the red line that you're seeing in terms of basically in terms of what's the word I'm looking for? In terms of a way from for these communities to bring the dark blue basically from that lower densities closer to what they have actually planned for their communities. It's still relatively lower, and while that range is really high, you'll see that you even have 1.8 units per acre in this area. That being said, I acknowledge that if it went from residential to residential, it's not necessarily captured here, but in case of like how many of those were potentially built from like 2 units into a 100-unit development, they're not a ton necessarily.
But it does suggest that it might be a good idea to do a flat monitoring sort of thing for the urban, well, now it's urban
Yeah.
and something else, urban
Edge.
edge. That we should be monitoring those developments as well to have better data.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Chair Wolf. We actually attempted to do that. This is years ago, like 10 years ago, to create some kind of a redevelopment monitoring program. But in that case, we, because it will be kind of on a voluntary basis, we had a really difficult time capturing the information from the communities, like basically asking them to send us that information. That being said, so it didn't work, they just didn't have time. I think it was more about capacity. It wasn't about, we don't want to tell you. That being said, and I will look to Angela on this, we have tried and have been thinking recently how we can capture that information again, not just for this kind of a purpose, but also understanding where redevelopment is generally happening. Is it closer to our other regional investments such as parks, transit, and so on, because they're more concentrated in these areas?
Not a lot to add to that. What I will say is that communities plan very differently for redevelopment than they do for regular change that they are anticipating and hoping for. A lot of times communities don't want to identify a specific redevelopment area based on parcels. Property owners get a little upset about that. What, you think my development's not up to par? Things like that. And so communities don't generally plan for redevelopment. It's harder for us to capture that information. And then in the developing side of it, it's hard for us to capture that information with building permit data. There's just some gaps in the information that we've been asking for that communities have been typically able to provide.
And I totally get the not wanting to be too specific about where it might redevelop, making people mad.
Yeah.
But
That's the main reason. It's hard to capture what they're planning
right.
in comparison to what they're doing.
But having a better handle on what they did would make decision-making easier for the future for them and
We
for
are
us.
looking into
Yeah.
how we can do that. Haven't been successful in nailing that down just yet.
Yeah.
Just as a suggestion here, this 1.5 or 8, is that a one-off? Is it one small project? If it is, I'd suggest removing those
The outlier.
outliers because it just distorts what
Yeah.
you're trying to communicate.
Well, I was
Especially
actually
if
gonna suggest
everybody
that
else
you put the width of the column varied based on the number of, data points at that density, units per acre. So if you've got a lot of
Yeah.
communities kind of clustering in the middle around, say, 30 units per acre, and then there's a few above that, that if you vary the width of the line, that'd be a way to capture
It's
that
almost
graphic.
better as like a scatter plot or
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
on the bar.
We did take out any significant outliers. However, there's a lot between the numbers, and so it's a really large range. And so it's hard to figure out what an outlier is unless it's a significant outlier, because you will have a bunch of stacking on the way towards the middle.
Some sort of width of bar or scatter chart or something like that would be a way to help represent that, understand it. Because everybody, I look at the green bar and I say, oh, great, everybody's doing 50. We're gonna get to where we wanna be in no time,
Well, just looking through these quickly, it's hard to figure out what is a good area or bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
The
because there's
variation in
Yeah.
each group.
Well, and we actually don't want you to be able to tell which areas are bad.
You did a good job.
You want to name names.
No.
A+ on that.
It's interesting how much bigger the actual build is than the planned. I mean, the range is much
Yeah.
Yeah.
bigger.
And
I will say, sorry, if I could, I will say in looking at we tried to plat out the data in many different ways, and I will say that in each of these columns, the majority was in the center, with the range being, the full breadth of what can exist in that area. Generally, what you'll see is an average midpoint-ish kind of cluster.
And in this specific case, for example, in the green, I would say the majority is somewhere between 4 or 4.3 and 22. That's where the majority is. In fact, 50 by itself is pretty an outlier. The one out after that is like 34. So as Angela mentioned, mostly like smack down in the middle.
But then if that's the case, then the conclusion of the recent decade are insufficient to bring the overall density of development to minimum planned densities. That actually, if the density is getting more dense, it's factually incorrect to say that the higher it actually can't be true if you are having if you are developing an area more dense, it cannot be true that they are insufficient to bring the overall density of development to minimum planned densities. I think the conclusion is wrong from the data.
Depends on the base.
What?
Remember that each number is a different city though.
Yeah, and I would say this, you're right that if you're thinking about where the majority of development has happened recently, more recently.
Yeah, you just run out of room. You just run out of room with the new requirements.
If you think about where the majority of development is happening recently, you're correct that generally it's getting denser than the existing, like the overall existing. However, that number is still far from the red, is what we're trying to say. It's that it is kind of, if you were to draw a line, it will be like this, of course, but it's because of the impact of the dark blue, it will take a lot of work.
But we're not trying to make the whole community the red.
Yeah, that
We're
was
only,
never the
new
intent.
development is what's being red, correct?
Yeah,
Correct. However, as most of these communities are getting more and more developed, you are left with the landscape of your residential landscape of your residential development as is. Cities are definitely going to move towards more redevelopment in those areas. Of course, you don't have a choice. That being said, though, then you'll see a lot of differences, and you'll see areas that are very low density in some of these communities that are still within MUSA. And the intention of all of this is making sure that, and this is also, let me say, this is the density within MUSA. So if a community was half in, half out, this is just the side of it that was in.
So wait, half of our MUSA area is actually farmed right now.
Yes, it
So we're
wasn't
penalized,
counted.
so our dark blue is really poor.
It is not counted in here,
Farmland is not,
No.
even if it's in MUSA?
yes.
it's
It would be
what's
only counted
been
if you
developed.
designated it as residential, right?
It's just residential.
So if it's not designated residential,
What
it
if it's
would be
homesteaded?
The farmstead part of it is the home.
The acre around the house.
But that farmland is not bringing the density down.
What if it's homesteaded?
This acreage was not calculated like that.
Okay.
This is based on like looking literally at the aerial imagery and saying where the home is, this is where the residential
Fair
is
enough.
happening.
And
Okay.
this is urban anyway, there's no farm.
Yeah.
But the emerging suburban.
Yeah, we'll get
I
there.
think just looking through them all again, if you look at the 2030, 2040, it shows the trends.
Right.
We are going towards higher
Higher
density.
planned density.
And that historical, you gotta know the base could be 5,000 units and you only develop 200 in the last
Yeah.
10 years, it's that base.
I will say, if you're absolutely correct, I will say that our requirements have also shifted between the 2030 plan and the 2040
I
plan.
think that's evidenced by the
Yeah.
turn blue and the red.
So, but we want to make sure that the practice also shifts, not just planned densities. And some of that, the planned density doesn't actually get developed necessarily. This is just planned. And because it's community-wide, in a community, you have areas that are designated as high density, then some as low density. Then what ends up happening is that the lower densities are being developed, the one that was identified as high density doesn't. That's what we generally see, and I can tell you from experience that we see those are the projects that come through. So, not saying high density isn't happening, don't get me wrong, they're definitely happening, many of them specialized housings like senior housing, affordable housing, or other things. But overall, when a community has a variety of ranges of land uses available, they are building here as opposed to here. So then they're just pushing out the higher density development. We'll get to that next decade, and
So
the
the
next
last
decade you're
development has
doing
to be the
another
most
comp
dense.
plan. Right,
Are
but then you're doing a different comp plan, and then keeps
Are-
happening.
you getting requests to increase the density from an R1 to 2 or something like that ever?
I'm guessing you're referring to the zoning
Yeah.
specifically, so we don't administer or anything related to zoning, but yes, we do get land use amendments that are changing the range, density range. If
That's-
that's what
But they go in both
Yeah.
directions,
They
we
do.
get both.
they do, yeah.
We do
Well,
get,
I'm guessing you're seeing more upside than down
depends on the community,
Mhm.
still.
yes.
Well, and I can say for our example, we have areas of our single family that are older and smaller lots, and the units per acre is probably above what the future plan is for that designation. We also have some areas with very large lots. Now, those are slowly getting subdivided, but I don't think currently they probably don't even meet the 3 in some areas if you zero in small enough. And so we've tried to, of course, designate a minimum across all of our single family that gets to the point so that if somebody does subdivide or property sells, they can't just plop one house back on a large lot. I suppose they can, come to think of it, because individual developments could be done that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it's a single home, you can't really say, no, you've got to build 3 on your property, so.
Right.
Yeah. So, but that just shows how slowly it can change over time if you've got a lot of single family and it's not very dense. It's not like people are building,
Yeah.
huge projects
That's
constantly.
Kind of what he was saying too. You've got a lot of existing.
So if you have, so if your existing number is really low because of your current situation, it's not necessarily going to evolve very quickly, as I think.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I will say too, I'll add on that our regional system is still serving those lowest developments as well. And so the system is providing service to lower density developments all the more, because land use doesn't change easily.
When it's hard to get a lot of new units per acre when you've only designated whatever 3 to 8 in your lowest density, that doesn't give you enough math to
Right.
quickly build up your numbers. So yeah, that makes sense.
And as we get, I'm gonna keep moving, and as we get further from the more of a core area, the lower density residential categories minimums get even lower. So you may have, like in a city, I don't remember Roseville specifically, you may not have any land uses less than 4 units per acre. And then you keep going further out and you have land uses that have a minimum of 0.25. So, and all of that is allowed within the comprehensive plan, but has to still meet the minimum density requirements, but as Angela mentioned, all of that picture together is what the system has to serve. So this is
It makes you wonder if some of those bottom communities are in the wrong land use designation.
well, in this case, I want to say at least for the 2030 and 2040 plans specifically, for those ones that you're seeing, and I did include them because I did want to bring that up, is because those are mostly communities that are so developed that have almost no growth associated with them. Their future land use table is literally that, 1 unit per acre is all they can accommodate. It may be 2 houses. Most of them either have no growth or declining growth. And in many of those cases, the land use review is very different. We don't, if you have no forecasted growth, we're not gonna say that you still have to plant for 5 units per acre. It's just like you literally have no growth. So you'll see those kinds of numbers in some of these more developed communities that have both absolutely no room, but also 0 growth.
And so they should almost be an asterisk and left
Kind of,
off
yes.
of the bar because it skews the information.
When you say no growth, you mean no projected population increase that they have to accommodate
Nothing.
in terms of what the
Yes.
Met Council's projecting for the future for
Yes.
that community.
The forecasted population for, in this case, 2040, was either zero change or actually lower.
Same number of households, but fewer people.
Sometimes they fewer households.
Do you have any undeveloped property?
They're in declining population. So in that case, they're like more at the 5 would be the minimum, but that was what the Thrive MSP 2040 dictated for suburban communities, minimum of 5.
Is that Rosemont?
No,
We're over.
no, Rosemont is a category after, it's a minimum of 3. They're 3.
We're a different
I think
category.
Roseville
I know
I think it's suburban edge.
I think Roseville is 5.
Yes,
Rosemount,
Roseville
I think,
is
is
5.
3. I believe.
We're way beyond it in the last year.
You meant Rosemont, so category so.
So then keep moving forward to the suburban edge communities, you'll see that the charts are getting a little tighter because these are communities that are experiencing less redevelopment. Most of them are in fact greenfield development or vacant to residential. So what is here is here. And their minimum in Thrive was 3 units per acre. And you'll see that that's what some communities plan for. And while that was okay, it actually put them in a very hard spot at times because they had zero flexibility. And we had instances of communities falling out of consistency because they accounted for absolutely no flexibility. That being said, so their existing development density, the dark blue, is very similar to what they've been doing in the last 10 years. Also still similar to what their 2030 was. So you can kind of like, it tracks so nicely together between the green and the light blue. And then the red, it just shows the difference in the requirements. So they're pretty consistent with what they have done in the last 10 years and what they said they're probably gonna be doing in the last 10 years. That was a positive thing. Then the last designation that we are talking about within MUSA is emerging suburban edge. Yeah, we dropped rural centers, yeah. Emerging suburban edge, sorry.
Madam Chair, I gotta leave for a few minutes. I'm gonna be receiving a call within a minute or two.
That's fine.
So I'll just won't bother anybody.
I'll take your vote.
Townships, put them in that urban, yes.
So in this case, it actually includes almost no townships because they are not within MUSA, most of them aren't anyway. You'll see that even though a lot of these communities are, almost all of the development is happening through greenfield development, they probably still have quite a bit of existing downtowns that are historic, that were developed decades ago. So they still have that kind of a existing pattern. That being said, in the smaller or more communities on the outer edge and even rural communities, their downtown areas are actually pretty dense. It's the rest of the community that is at a much lower density. So even though the existing development in the last decade has been higher than what they have on the ground already, it's still, like you see, it's as low as 1.5, and a lot of those are at those kinds of levels. And it's still a lot of ways to go towards the minimum requirement. So it's still lower than the minimum requirement. Not saying they were inconsistent or that what they approved were inconsistent with their plans. It's just that they ended up developing the lower parts of their plans.
Sure. Makes sense.
And finally, several of these communities, in total 45 actually, of the communities are participants of the plat monitoring program. Plat monitoring program, as Angela mentioned, is a credit program It is meant to account for actual developed densities. And the information for this program goes as far back as 2000. So we included the most recent information, which is from 2000 to 2022. Whoever is a part of this program can basically report as far back as 2000 they want to. It only communities who are on the developing edge and are doing greenfield development are eligible for the plat monitoring program, and it only accounts for sewer residential permits. So if there are communities that like half of them are going through like septic developments or something that is just not served, it's not gonna be counted towards the plat monitoring program. So overall, plat monitoring program has helped a lot of communities in the past in their density calculation, and the gray in here, so the rest of them are the same and it's just for these communities, but the gray is basically what you're seeing, a range of densities that have been developed in between 2000 and 2022 in communities that were members of the plat monitoring program. So that's a way larger time frame. I do want to point that includes the development boom of the mid-2000s. We, in fact, in the plat monitoring program itself, we have the highest amounts of plats in year 2005, between 2005 and 2007, actually between 2003 and 2005, before the decline. So the fact that the information in plat monitoring goes that far back means that some of those that seem pretty high may not have been necessarily in the last decade. But as of now, we consider the plat monitoring information for the entire period that we have, and that is between 2000 and 2022. So that being said, I think I said something that may have directed the conversation. I said developed density. Plat monitoring is platting density, which is giving communities even more of a benefit than the developed density, because there are plenty of plats that don't get built and or get replatted for lower densities.
Then you don't take them out when they...
No, we are giving them credit for their best effort, because the reason that those plats don't happen usually are related to the market, are related to the developer. They go bankrupt, they change plans, whatever it is. That being said, if it does get replatted, we don't double count it. But if it gets replatted to a lower number of units, we still count the higher one.
And there was a lot of that happened after when we had the recession.
Yeah.
Townhome lots got replatted as single family because townhomes weren't selling. Now they're starting to sell again.
Yeah. So that's a huge credit to communities, because if they said that we're gonna we platted this, we're gonna have it developed, but then something happened, they still get the credit. So the platted activity, the platted density is different still than the developed density, but you see that the platted density is much higher than the developed density. So that still suggests that several of the plats are probably remaining undeveloped. And I can point you to the plat monitoring program that we annually report on. The presentation was in July that reported on the 2022 information, and that does actually include in much further detail information about lot absorption, basically. How long does it take, on average, it's all average, how long does it take for a plat to be realized as an actual development? And it varies between it got platted this year, it got built this year, the same year, all the way to it took 12 years. And or some plats that they're platted 19 years ago and they're still not built. So there are a variety of them out there. So and we had quite a bit of discussion. I'm really glad that we did, and I do have some additional questions that I want to make sure that we address. Before we dive into that, going back to regional goals, that these are the 5 regional goals that were endorsed by the Metropolitan Council that are about our region is equitable, inclusive, healthy and safe, dynamic and resilient, addresses climate change, and protects and restores natural systems. So all of the different policy areas, including land use, in our policy drafting are trying to address these goals. And as a matter of fact, these are the draft land use objectives that you have seen. Sorry, I should have said objectives, because it's goal, objective, policy. We're at the objective level. This is what you saw in the last month. When was it? September.
Last meeting.
Thank you. Last meeting. Last LUAC meeting. These are our draft land use objectives. Of course, we have been working on it, trying to make it better, but this is what you saw at the meeting in September, which are trying to address those goals. Some of these land use objectives, as you may recall from the September presentation, address several of these goals at the same time. They're not a one-for-one kind of a relationship. So these objectives then trickle down to policy, one of which is density. So trying to achieve a region that is healthy and safe, that protects natural resources, that all of the goals that you saw, then through, for example, maximizing choice within communities, designing places where everyone feels connected, maximizing development of places accessible. These are the things that then will inform the policies that get into more detail, including density. So
And those haven't been updated based on our input last time, I don't think,
Right.
right?
No,
Those are just as they
hardly
were.
anybody has seen them yet,
Yeah,
so.
okay, just to be sure.
Yeah.
'Cause I noted some things that were in the minutes that hadn't been reflected in
No,
those,
we
and that's
just
because you haven't
presented it
done
as you saw it with no change.
Thank you.
We continue to brainstorm and think about how we can make them better, how we can make them more people-centered and something that, and taking into feedback from you, but that's what you saw. So, I forgot to page through my stuff. There we go. So what we know in general is that basically there's a long-term impact of development, and that is when, that's what we talked about. When something gets developed, it's gonna be there for decades. So any decision is gonna be a very long-term decision. In fact, I think residential land uses are some of those land uses that change less than any other. So to keep that in mind and understanding that past land use practices impact existing and future development patterns. And a lot of the times you'll see that like if you have a certain pattern in a neighborhood, you can't all of a sudden randomly build a skyscraper in the middle of it. So even though the city wants to build at a higher density, the existing pattern may kind of prevent it from going a certain direction because you want seamless transitions most of the time. And that we saw that there's a gap between that minimum density requirement and that what is actually being developed. Again, what is actually being developed is still consistent with the comp plans as they are, but it shows that they're being developed on the lower side of the spectrum, on the lower end, not side, on the lower end. Basically higher development densities in the past decade haven't been enough necessarily to bring it too high. And except for one instance, most of the last decade developments have been even below the 2030 community planned densities in the 2030 plans. But we saw that one designation from the suburban edge.
Are we the instance, Corcoran?
Say again?
Is Corcoran the?
Yeah, I can actually,
You don't have to tell
No,
me, we can do it a different
I can
time.
hand these to you. I didn't hand it first because I thought
We know
that
what happens.
You would look at them and.
Yes. Sorry.
Here's the real good pad. You want me to mark your stuff?
So this is basically,
Do I get one?
Oh, we're just
Or we went
below.
over. No, I have printed
We're
out
going
several.
down.
Okay.
I don't know how that's possible.
Thank you. Yeah, he,
I did.
no, he gave Terry
Is-
one. He's
I
got-
don't need them.
There's one extra for you.
Oh, sure.
So all the numbers that you saw, here are the actual numbers. Feel free to cruise through them at a, like right now, later time, and ask me any questions that you have specifically. I do want to identify why there are gaps in these numbers. You'll see that one is left empty, for example. Some of them in the 2040 plans, the ones that are left empty are either because we don't have the comp plan or that there was no density, there was no change. So that 1 unit per acre even wasn't there because they had zero growth or declining growth. So there wasn't any density to go by. The same goes for 2030 plan. That's why there are no numbers in some of the cases. If there are instances where there are gaps in what was developed in the last decade, that's because there was no change in anything else to those land uses that I mentioned to residential during that decade. That's why there's a gap there. We weren't able to calculate density for that. So that's just a quick note on this table before you. But with everything that we heard on different community designations, then thinking about the council goals and the draft land use objectives that you've seen, we're thinking that there are a few things that we can do to potentially think about how we can encourage and or make sure that development is happening more closer to what the requirements are, and or making sure that they are more on par with the objectives, with the goals, with the MUSA. That being said, there are additional things that we will discuss with you for sure, but that's what I said in the beginning. These are examples and land use approaches that don't include the actual density number, but they're about how you can implement it. What can you do better around implementation of minimum density? So I'm just going to go through them and we can discuss them however you want because I have some questions on these. These are all possibilities. None of them are basically have been vetted and or definitely going to happen or anything like that. We're bringing it to you for your feedback. One option is that we can increase the minimum density requirements. If the minimum density requirements are higher, maybe then it will get developed a little higher than what was developed because it's kind of like pushing it a little higher than what it's saying. We can also restrict MUSA expansion. Our analysis, not this specific analysis, but an adjacent analysis has shown that actually within the current MUSA, within the 2040 MUSA, I should say, within the 2040 MUSA, there is enough land to accommodate all of the population growth without even 1 acre of expansion. So that is one thing that we can, I'm not saying not to restrict the expansion altogether, but make it so that it just is, there's more requirements, there's some additional thoughts and criteria into expanding MUSA. We can establish a minimum density requirement for all new connection to the regional sewer system. That is to say that currently the criteria for sewer extension permits is that we review those for consistency with the comprehensive plan, whatever the comprehensive plan is. Like I said, it could be 1 to 5 units per acre and the density is 1.2. That means it's consistent. Our staff also looks for making sure that it's within MUSA, making sure that it's staged correctly, but the land use consistency is just consistency with the comp plan. That being said, that allows for very low densities to continue to go through without the higher densities being necessarily built. So here's a suggestion. establish a minimum density. Every new connection has to be 3 units per acre, for example. So, if they're within USA. We can, I'm gonna go this way. We can explore other incentives that advance regional goals as part of flexibility in meeting the density requirements. This is to show that, for example, we had the goal of climate change and also preserving natural resources. We are in the process of updating the regionally significant ecological areas, for example. Maybe there can be additional incentives for if you are preserving those areas, if you are, to the best of your ability, are preserving wetlands, not building over them, and not just in one development, but actually adopting ordinances that truly protect those areas, then there could be an incentive to meet those goals.
Do we have places that are filling in a lot of wetlands?
Yes,
And
they just pay a fee.
really?
They buy wetland credits. It's
Okay,
about
That's, well,
170,000 an acre for wetland credits
okay.
in Hennepin County.
Yeah, Lakeville, there was some wetland banking, but it wasn't a huge thing. I didn't know that there were places that are filling in a lot of them.
I just created 12 acres of wetland, but didn't enroll in the wetland credit program.
You created and you didn't get the 170,000, I would have taken the cash.
It's a long story, but it's fine.
Okay.
Okay, keep going.
Again, this is at the idea level. That was just, I don't have additional detail necessarily to provide how that incentive would work. But we have other incentives in other programs that aren't related to density exactly, but we can mimic some of the other council programs and making sure that we are using it in this instance as well. We can calculate density requirements per decade rather than over the planning horizon. As I mentioned sometime in the beginning of this presentation, when the 2040 comp plans came in, which was sometime between 2018 and 2020, for example, then the communities had identified new development and redevelopment between that time and 2040. And all they had to do was meet the minimum density requirement between that time and 2040. This approach would say that you have to meet it in the 2020 to 2030 decade and 2030 to 2040 decade to basically prevent from that pushing of the higher density developments to the next decade. So that you're actually planning for it to happen now. The other approach can be to establish a target density in addition to minimum density requirements. And that can be something that goes, for example, hand in hand with the incentive. So that here's your minimum, but here's a target. Like maybe your minimum is 5 units per acre, but your target is 8. If you build at 8 units per acre, here are some like incentives to build at that kind of a density. Another one is to consider all land guided to support growth, not just areas of change. That I need to explain a little bit because in the calculation of future density, what we take is just the areas of change. Basically saying, even though 2030 hasn't happened yet, but whatever we approved or authorized in your 2030 plan, we'll set that aside, and then we'll just think about the areas of change. So basically, if there were areas that were didn't change between your 2030 and 2040 plan, even though they aren't built. Like in your 2030, you said this area is gonna be high density, or low density, and in 2040, you said this area is gonna be low density, and you didn't necessarily change that, it wouldn't count against you. And that's how some of those communities that had no change basically were able to like move forward. But instead of that, saying, no, this is, even though it's we approved this separately, but this is a new plan, this area is currently vacant and has a potential for development, of course, any redevelopment as well, but we rely on the cities to tell us where the redevelopment is, because as Angela mentioned and Chair Wolf noted as well, cities don't necessarily want to identify on a map where redevelopment is, which is, we totally understand. We haven't required that in many areas, but we still need the acreage. So all of that would be considered as potential available land to meet your density. And finally, include all existing development and density calculation, so that you basically, whatever is developed in the past still comes in the calculation, so that you're thinking about it truly community-wide, not just some parts of your community. These are some approaches that we have brainstormed. We can do all of these in order to get closer to the land use objectives, and then to the goals as a result. I want to hear if you have additional insights or ideas to consider. Do you think you have enough information to answer that question?
Can you put it back on the other slide so we
Yeah.
have the list? I mean, people have it written down.
Turn it off.
Okay, so you're first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I like the element where you reward higher density, and I think the Met Council has the power and authority that you could issue me credits as a community to use for future development to cut costs for the next project on down the road. Assuming that it's more efficient to the region when we have higher density because of the sewer costs. So by issuing those credits, so I get a development, let's say it's at 20 units an acre, and it's much more than 12 that I said, and figure out some calculation. So then I got that credit in the bank, because as communities, developers are always looking at ways, how do I make the next project efficient? Here's some credits.
May I ask a question? Do you mean in addition to the flat monitoring program? Because something like that for the city of Rosemount, for example, Rosemount is a participant.
Yeah.
We will get that information and we will get that credit. So,
But I'm just saying SAC charges.
Like SAC credits.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I mean, I'm
Oh.
saying real dollars, but you would have to come up with it. So what is the efficiency that by these credits, yes, you know, it's accounting, but it is, that's what would derive.
That could get messy really fast.
Well, not, the harder it is, the better the result though, maybe.
Oh, talking about government here.
Excuse me.
Sausage.
But anyway, I still think they're a credit of some type
Okay,
that cities can leverage with development.
and if you think of, if more details come into your head, you can share that. John?
Yeah, so, we, in our city, and we're no different than some other cities, the mantra from our citizens is we don't wanna look like Maple Grove. There's nothing wrong with Maple Grove, but every single development is the same, where they have, you know, one third of an acre on down the line. And we don't get along with Met Council that well in Corcoran. So I kind of look for ways to cooperate and come up with a better outcome. I'd be hard pressed to have Corcoran embrace the idea of apartments. What we want is interesting neighborhoods with focal points that are nature-based. We want open field preservation, and we also like some of these ideas, like the bicycling, safe and all these things. And so we have an apartment situation on the docket to review in February, and we could probably have, if there was some way to, if we had clustered high density in some areas of our town, and the exchange from the Met Council would be flexibility, so we could have low density developments and still connect them to the sewer in some rational way that doesn't, negatively impact the functionality of the sewer system. If there was some way we could have that exchange, not of monetary or SAC charges or whatever, you know more about that than me, but we could have more housing, more density, but actually more open spaces.
Mhm.
And the people in our town, if we present, because anytime an apartment building goes up, I get voicemails and emails, we don't need apartments, and I totally agree with that. Except if there was something that you could get by having a clustered, high-density area. And my thing would be like, it has to be more than just, we'll do that, or some informal program, because governors and Met councils come and go. Like I wouldn't trust that we'd put our apartments in and then like the 2060 plan, we'd have to take all those 1 acre lots and make them, 5 per or something. I mean, it would have to be something much more formal than just an internal thing, but I think we could get on board some of our outer edge stuff with some of the stuff to increase flexibility or density, which is what you want, on an aggregate basis. If we could just treat it more like each town like somewhat like a PUD, or have some give and take to, like within rigid standards, you end up with the same thing over and over and over again. If we had some flexibility on standards and credits.
But isn't that how we do it now?
What?
You do get credit, you get flexibility on the low end if you've got some high end to bring your overall number up.
We just talked, our city planner just talked to the Met Council about that, and
To who?
I don't know,
Probably a sector rep, Raya.
we don't, and I specifically asked, if we build those apartments with, it's like 60 per, it's 60 per acre.
Yeah,
If we build these, do we get to have open space? And then the other thing, we kind of had a conversation, and maybe there's just this miscommunication, but we also want to have like areas where we preserve nature, and those get counted against you apparently in your calculations too.
not if you put them in an outline.
Yeah.
Or if they're protected by ordinance. So if you have a natural resources protection ordinance, something that's adopted by the city council, that also allows that to be taken out.
I was
would
told
say-
those have to be designated before the plot gets developed.
No, as part of the plat, that counts.
When they're planning. And the other thing is that it can just be park. It doesn't have to be I have this specific ordinance, as long as it's public
So if
open
we had
space.
50 acres and we put 40 acres of park, we wouldn't have to meet the 3 per on the outlying
You
10
still-
acres?
You still have to meet the density requirement of that land use category, whatever it is. But as of now, at least, the density isn't, the overall density, that 3 units per acre minimum, isn't calculated on a site-by-site basis. So as long as that project, whatever project it is, whether apartment, single-family home, duplex, townhome, as long as it's consistent with the future land use guiding of the site, whatever that future land use guiding is, and overall doesn't drop the overall city's density below 3.
Can we have my staff, or not my staff, but our city, like, we've talked about this issue 4 times in council. 4 times our staff has had communication with the Met Council that have totally kiboshed my ideas around clustering high density developments, about keeping open spaces. Like, there's something really
think-
wrong in the communication.
Well, I think that there's probably some factors that we don't know and
Yeah.
responding right now that Freya probably does know. And there's probably some specifics that impact the decisions as to whether or not flexibility is permitted based on these rules, or whether or not credits are given through the plat monitoring program. I assume Corcoran is part of the plat monitoring
It is.
program, okay. And as part of that, it depends too what your existing starting density is. So if you don't have a lot of flexibility, it depends
just
on
got
whether
going.
or not.
We're hardly a town.
It's just within the MUSA area.
Yeah, it's 3.4.
Just your area within.
Yeah, 3.3 is
Nothing.
in plat monitoring.
See, this is where complication does not improve. So if you're telling me, yeah, but then qualify.
Well, it kind of, again, it, as Angela mentioned, there may be some additional piece of information that city
Yeah.
staff provided to
And Angela
us.
can check with
Yeah.
Raya and try to figure out where the miscommunication is. Because generally, yes, you can have apartments offsetting your other stuff, and you can have publicly owned open space not counted in your density calculations.
Then we gotta get together off
It
meetings
does
so I
have,
don't
yeah.
Yeah.
spend more time on Corcoran than I.
Yeah, no, but that's good that you brought it up, but yeah, there will be follow-up that happens.
Sorry, guys.
It's
Okay.
fascinating.
Who else? Phil?
Okay.
Oh, wait, Jerry
Go
was
ahead,
waiting
go ahead.
first, and then Phil.
I'm somewhat confused here. Everything I heard today is about more density. Is this the Met Council saying we want more density in new construction? Or what are you basing all this?
You missed that part when you were out
Oh,
talking on the phone.
okay.
Some communities haven't been making their 3 units per acre, and we're trying to figure out how to do
Oh,
that.
okay,
And
okay.
it's only communities within the MUSA, so it doesn't apply to the rural areas, out where you are.
Oh, okay, because I was gonna say,
No, we wouldn't do
a
that
lot of
to you
stuff's
here.
going on in Waconia, but it's all single-family
Well,
houses.
they've decided when you're gone, they're
Victoria's
putting
all
apartments.
single-family.
Yes,
I read.
we're putting apartments in your township now. We
But
haven't
I-
figured that out.
Underlying the billions we put into the treatment facilities, we need the density.
Yeah, I can understand that, but where I come from, it's all single-family houses.
But not in townships, because we're not going to hook our sewers up to you.
It's good, you got the whole.
It costs too much money.
Yeah, the
Well, it's
township,
too expensive.
the township areas are outside of MUSA, but also
Except
there are
for
many
White
of
Bear
those
Lake.
areas that we don't want sewered. A lot
But we wanna
of these
preserve
areas
the-
are to be preserved as agricultural, as open space there. We want the areas that are prime for development within MUSA that can accommodate the growth already to develop at that kind of a capacity in order to not take more agricultural land, to not take more open space and wetland and things like that, to preserve areas outside of MUSA as well.
Okay,
So-
Phil's turn. You gotta wait, Phil.
I agree with Bill, I think there should be incentives, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated, but I totally agree with that. One of the things that we could look at being incentivized is from a water standpoint, when we have higher densities, we're gonna have to use more water. And, this White Bear Lake thing, and I hate to bring this up, but, within the next couple of months, there's gonna be a decision made by the judge, and there may not be any more expansion at all come on the East Metro, period, 0.
Until
So-
we spend a lot of money on infrastructure to bring water from somewhere else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, as it's written right now, we can't even pull water, well, as it's written, we wouldn't be able to pull water off the stormwater ponds that we have to irrigate our lawns. It's nuts. But anyways, that's the kind of thing I think that we need to look at is how can we incentivize with higher population, having more water conservation projects put in place.
Okay, Bill is chomping at the
I
bit. Did you want to
was
answer
I
that
just
first?
wanna say something to maybe alleviate some of the concern a little bit. Something like the White Bear Lake area, like water issue that is ongoing right now, and some other concerns related to capacity of development are things that we are taking into consideration even in our forecasting.
Okay.
Of course, as you mentioned, it's just at a very odd stage of the process. Nobody knows what's gonna happen and or what the capacity actually is, so it's kind of in flux. But it certainly is something that is on the top of our minds.
And we're not gonna have an answer before we hit our deadline of when we have to put out the regional plan.
Sure. But this can be amended as we go forward.
Just
Yeah.
a
Yes.
quick
That's
comment.
cool, that's fine.
High density does not use more water, it uses less. because you don't have the yard. You triple the water usage in suburbs during the summer, and it's just yard use, so density does not use more water.
Hockey rinks.
Dan?
A little bit of feedback on the approaches there. So I think, the one in the lower right corner about including existing development and density calculations,
Yeah.
it might be interesting, or to think about how we can look at that in terms of the projections too, or make sure that communities are like continually making progress to grow their historical, everything included density in the right direction. Maybe that's a part of looking at some of those target densities too, is you can say, cities can try to achieve, their overall community density going up higher, over a period of time, and look at those shorter windows as well. I think there's some ways to combine some of these things, is I guess what I was getting at. And on the minimum density requirement for all new connections to the sewer system, my only comment there is that almost becomes a minimum density land use requirement then, so you might want to just call it what it is. Unless you're getting sophisticated enough to say, okay, we're gonna look at this portion of the piping system, and anything that goes in within this geographic area that's covered by these pipes needs to be 3 on average over the whole area. So you could have some parts of that area that are 1 and 2 or whatever, a quarter and something, but as long as it averages 3 over the whole area, because that's what that portion of the system is designed to handle, and I'm not an expert on those piping systems, but it seems like there's a way you could potentially link those without just making it a minimum land use requirement across the board.
Raya, you wanted to answer that?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention that 3 units per acre is the minimum. Yet it's not necessarily, it's met in the future land use guidings, but isn't necessarily met in, as communities are developing right now, because it's been averaged out kind of.
Right, but you're also saying people are doing sort of the minimums that they have and not getting up to the 3 necessarily.
Yes,
So I think I was trying to figure out ways to
Thank you.
make it work.
I thought of it like that.
And my thought, looking at that restrict NUSA expansion, is it would push up the cost of land for everybody.
Which
Because
one?
the
Top center.
Restrict
The
NUSA expansion.
center
Yeah,
top one,
Absolutely.
it would push up land costs for everybody,
Correct.
everywhere in the region, for every use.
Yep.
Because some communities aren't meeting their densities, and that seems like you're taking a sledgehammer when you need a toothpick kind of a
I think
response.
Hudson would thank us in
Yeah.
western Wisconsin.
And LeSueur and
Yeah.
Monticello, and yeah. And then I kind of like the idea of calculating the density over decades, but one of the things that the market drives is when apartment buildings come in. People will build single family absolutely anywhere. And there's not that calculation that goes in, but apartment buildings, they're very much into the data on are they gonna get a return on their investment, and there's only certain market conditions where they will come in. And like Lakeville went more than 20 years without getting a market rate apartment building. There was still some high density being built, but it was all subsidized because there was no market rate developer that wanted to touch it. Now there's market rate buildings going up like crazy, and I don't want to punish communities for being at the beginning of the development cycle. And even in Lakeville, I mean, we have the Dakota County CDA that does all of the planning and financing and everything for the subsidized housing. But communities in Hennepin County or places that don't have that centralized planning of their affordable housing would be at a real disadvantage. If you're a small community and you're trying to figure out that complicated stuff, we're basically punishing a small community early in its development cycle because there's not somebody that's helping with those other needs.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think that, I don't know when this goes live or whatever, I think this is the most important thing, that it is the Land Use Advisory Committee. I believe that this is the most important thing we do, and it's the one time one of the most important times when elected local officials who are involved with crafting legislation or local code and approving development interacts with the Met Council and the people that make these rules. I would be open to, but having another meeting specifically and only about further brainstorming on some of your Met Council brainstormed ideas and how to accomplish some of the things that we're all looking to do. I would hate to have this not be given time and really a thoughtful approach, since this is gonna impact every community in their 2050. That's just my opinion.
We've already canceled the second agenda item for today because this is an important discussion, and I too would be open to having a whole nother meeting. And fleshing out the details, the pros and cons of some of these and other ideas, and asking for feedback from other stakeholders as well.
We are doing
Okay,
that. And we will bring this back at the next meeting.
Just on the restricted MUSA expansion, I mean, MUSA doesn't just expand willy-nilly. I mean, there's a regular and organized process for it to happen, right? And people communities have to request joining MUSA or something like that, I imagine, and there's criteria and all that. So I think that's already the restriction. I don't know that you need to go beyond that necessarily.
Well, any MUSA expansion has to go through the Metropolitan Council through an amendment process, a comprehensive plan amendment process, and we evaluate capacity. And in many of the areas, there is enough capacity for the kind of expansion that is happening. That's it. There is no other restriction. There is no other, we would like it not to expand,
what's the historical
but-
expansion look like? Is it, I mean, are we continually adding significant amounts each
well, we
period of time? Or?
Chip away at the edges
Yeah,
constantly.
yeah.
And when we did the last round of the regional plan, because we had that sort of decade of lost development because of the recession, we kept the plan for the MUSA the same. We could do that again, but I fear that that would lead to much higher land prices, because when we make that calculation, we're not looking at, do those people really want to sell? I mean, there's still a farm in Bloomington. You know, they've been hanging on to developable land for a very, very long time. And there are some properties that are just more difficult that happen, you know, maybe at the end of a community's growth, because, I mean, like, look at along 35 in Bloomington, all those hills and everything that are now apartment buildings. They were challenging spots to develop on, and they developed last because, partly because they were guided for the wrong thing, but partly because they were really challenging to develop.
And overall, as Chair Wolf mentioned, we have drawn MUSA line based on what communities told us in the 2040 plan. Like, this is where we want to see, where we see a growth happening. Our staff still did an analysis of capacity. Do we have capacity to do this? And we do have the long-term service area to kind of guide in terms of, this is where the general capacity of the system, like the direction and the pipes and things like that are. But otherwise, the MUSA as is, it was informed by the local plans. Any other comments? Any questions, maybe?
Well, just your last comment, you can't emphasize that enough because it gets skewed. But that MUSA line dictated by more the local community with your local knowledge gets lost in the whole system. And it comes up, Met Council dictated this. It's funny how that works, but.
Well, sometimes it takes the pressure off when the local landowner is pissed that they didn't get it on the right.
But I was
side.
gonna say, Jerry can go home, next board meeting you can say, dang it, the Met Council isn't interested in our township at all. You won.
No growth.
Take credit for it.
Yeah, most of them would probably be glad to hear that, I think.
And not every community does that sort of analysis either, though. I was talking to a mayor who shall not be named because I don't want to identify the community. And they're going around actually talking to all the landowners now to find out, do you want to develop or not? Because they've been putting them in the map all this time without ever asking them, hey, if you could develop, would you? And that's kind of important information to have.
Well, one other comment here, I just had a meeting yesterday with a council member of a moderate-sized city, and the frustration that's out there at city levels is just understanding what are the demands out there in the market. And that's a hard thing to know. And what do you have? Is it townhomes, apartments, etc.? Generally speaking, I'd say it's all of the above. However, they need data. Now, CDA supposedly has gone through and putting together information, but like just today I was told, we have 10,000 people on the waiting list for credits, voucher credits, on a wait list in Dakota County. And half of those, you can put your name on multiple counties. Half of them want to be in Dakota County. So that's 5,000 people, and we only have capacity for 200 a year. So I mean, you're on there 6-8 years. And then even if you get the credit, there's a problem that if you don't have housing units, case in point, an apartment building that I can use that credit, it doesn't do me any good. So I mean, there's such a complex whole story that really needs to be understood at the city frontline level. That there's just gaps on knowledge and information, that there is a good story. Again, I go back to the Met Council. It's the best story across the country on the efficiency of having one system under central planning, but the billions that it takes to run that system, we need that maximum development within the 7-county metro.
Not everywhere, just where we have capacity.
Well, get a graduated consistent plan development, and that's a hard thing to do.
Well, and just talk about, the knowing what the market is trying to do is not easy to do either, because not even the people that are building a lot of the developments know for sure what's going to happen. I think it's speculation in a lot of cases, and people are going to continue to build the thing that's in demand until suddenly, it's not in demand anymore, and sometimes the only way you find out is when your project fails or something like that.
Somebody just mentioned, I'm in new development, Pulte, the standard 2-story, 650, 700,000. They're doing on slab 2-story, 5.5 setbacks to get below that 500 with the interest rates and buyers.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I mean, I see it everywhere. D.R. Horton's doing absolutely no more, you come in and pick your home. They build everything here. You got ABC, there's your home. I'm not doing that individual, and it's cost that's driving significant changes out there in the market.
And there are some developers that are offering lower rate mortgages to
all
people across the home too.
For 2-year, 5-year, and then you can refinance or buying down the front end, but that's a short-term incentive.
We're almost out of time. What do we have for thoughts? Go ahead.
I'd just like to ask, if we're going to have this conversation brought back at the next meeting, what do you need from us in order to help build out that conversation? What information do you need? What kind of ideas or brainstorming or additional context do you need in order to do that?
I'm sure it would be helpful, I think, for each of these, to the extent that it can be brainstormed, is some of the pros and cons of each one, or some of the the SWOT analysis, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. But that would be helpful to have a start on some of that, and even maybe a start as to some possible forms that those incentives could take, or something like that, if there's thoughts along those lines. I'm sure that'll get our juices flowing in terms of how we respond to those, and then maybe build on that. So
And
I mean,
could
that's a
they-
lot of work for staff, I understand, but I think that would help start the conversation or move the conversation forward to the next step.
How might that make a difference in the communities that are at the bottom of the density and not making their numbers without having a negative impact on somebody else?
Yeah, because it's not always just a pro and a con, it's a pro for somebody and a con for somebody else. Yeah.
Well, I'd say, Madam Chair, some key messages from the Met Council in planning. And density is not a bad word. It was much worse 20 years ago than where we're at today. So I mean, what is the message in this next cycle without it being the hammer?
Mhm.
That could be communicated at every council level, mayor, council.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I was just gonna say, the message is we have projected population increase in this region. It has to be accommodated somehow, and we've got the infrastructure to, will either work or won't work with it, and so this is the way to try to match projected growth with the infrastructure.
Well, and we have to be ready for more than we will actually get because of choice, you know,
Correct.
you gotta offer.
Well, that's why we had those
Offer
5
people
scenarios in
choices.
our several months ago, yeah.
But I think on the equity lens side also, some of our communities, I could have stayed as a small 3 units per acre, but I'm excluding a heck of a lot of people out of my community by not having that diverse housing.
Mhm.
So I think that needs to be also a message in there going forward.
Well, and one of the biggest areas of growth is gonna be old people. So what do we need to change for that?
Zero entry on slabs.
Small lawns.
Yeah, no lawn, saving water.
That's we're 55 plus, way over our heads in program.
What do you
love them
wanna
all.
say, Rose?
I just wanted to ask from you and
Yeah.
other committee members, you mentioned something, but also I want to know, besides the, some of the information that you mentioned, which are more words and text, are there additional, well, sorry, that came out wrong. But what I meant was that, are there additional data analysis, like numbers, that you would like to see, like something that you feel like you didn't see? Because we will certainly brainstorm, we'll try to do some kind of a SWOT analysis, if not all 4 sections, at least pros and cons. But are there other numbers you need to see? Just want to make sure.
I think, you know, like we talked about before on the graphs, understanding sort of where,
Yeah,
you know, obviously we have
Just
the
scatter
range,
plot,
but if everything is contributing in that certain zone, you know, and that relates to the same, you know, if in the green bar, everything clusters in a certain area, and in the red bar, everything clusters in a different area, that's probably the comparison that shows more clearly the point that you were trying to make, is
Yeah.
that they're not matching. So that would be a way to help us understand as well as when we talk to other people about it.
Maybe having 1 or 2 communities we could put up on the map also, so to understand why
Community
their
X, community
numbers.
Y.
And we won't pick on
Any
Minneapolis
volunteers?
again, no, excluding Minneapolis or St. Paul.
Sure.
But pick out a couple communities that would explain what they did and why it increased the number or decreased. Because Richfield having such a low number, it sort of sounds like an outlier.
Can I ask, would it be okay if we made it anonymous, like we describe the
Sure.
That's
character?
what I was
Sure,
gonna suggest,
Describe the character, but not like identify it on a map,
Mhm.
Yeah.
so
Oh, yeah.
you know where it is in the region, just
100%.
to
That's fine.
make
As
it
long
as
as there's
unbiased as we can.
subliminal message,
Right.
it's like,
You know, you could say, this is, you know, this is an urban, or an urban edge, or this is a
Yes.
suburban or whatever, and just leave it
I
at that.
wouldn't even put it on the map,
No.
Right.
because you can
That's not
figure
necessary.
out.
Okay. But
Just
an
anonymize
example.
it and let us work through the issues.
And try not to
Correct.
mention their major
Yeah.
regional mall that they have or
I
something
would,
like that.
can I ask one question?
You can always.
Numerically, So I would prefer that this conversation, these metrics, stay on the level of density and not get sidetracked by like some of the other things that go on, Met Council's other stuff. We're talking about density.
Yeah.
And all the other stuff is important, but I want the conversation to be specifically on density goals and how to meet them and the exchange on density. And that's it.
And not wander into other,
Oh, not the rabbit holes that sometimes these things, because I think the primary function, maybe other people disagree, but is sewer. So how can we have the sewer function? And then we can design our own communities as we see fit or whatever, but meet the density requirements.
Can I ask a question?
yes,
By its nature, a couple of these ideas and approaches do involve a little outside, such as incentivizing the density calculation by protection of natural resources and things like that.
Yeah,
You-
well
you didn't mean
that's an
that,
obvious
right?
one,
Yeah,
because it takes space.
right, but so that's not what you meant,
It's a
right?
spatial issue. Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Do you have an example of maybe what
Yeah,
you have
like
in mind?
Like I wouldn't wanna get bonus extra because we have a certain kind of, like we have more senior homes, so we get to have extra credit. Like that, I like how your focus has been on sewer.
okay.
Madam Chair, just to,
You definitely get to talk, you haven't said a
emphasize,
word.
Save the best for last.
I just want to, I guess, reemphasize something that you said about like how we collectively, value the existing agricultural land that still exists in rural areas, and in order to maintain that as is, productive agricultural land that offers people that type of lifestyle as well, which is another choice, and people love choice, that means that other areas that are more, comfortable with increasing density, that's just another factor, and increasing density elsewhere in the area means those rural areas get to kind of retain that character. So I would shine a light on that as well. And I second Mayor Rowe's suggestion for a more dynamic, another dimension on that bar graph. 'Cause
Yeah.
once we got the list,
Cool.
that helped understand the bar graph much more.
Cool, and we are at 6:00 basically.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody,
Thank
for a
you.
great conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
If you can think of anything else between now and the next time we meet, please do reach out to me, or my contact is in the presentation. And
I just have one last thing, if I
Yes.
could. Sandy's gonna be out of the office, and so if you would normally respond to Sandy on something, feel free to forward any comments or questions to me, and I will help.
Anybody, meeting is adjourned.